Hey, spoilers. Aesthetically speaking, Trek to Yomi is the most beautiful game that I have ever played, and in all honesty, it's not even close. In fact, it's so far out in front that I came to that conclusion long before actually finishing my 5-hour playthrough, and thus this video has been stewing in the bizarre cauldron of my phone's note page for a month or so now. With its visuals stunning reflection of the golden era of the samurai film and the considered cinematography that has gone into every moment of both its cutscenes and its gameplay, I think it would be difficult to argue that this isn't, at the very least, pretty for what is really quite a simple side-scroller. And of course, I'm not the first person to notice this. If you go to its Wikipedia page, you'll probably notice that all of the praise in the reception category is basically just an extremely long-winded way of writing "looks cool" in big bold letters. But Trek to Yomi's gorgeous images are perhaps less of a blessing and more of a curse, because every criticism seems to argue that they paper over the cracks in a game that is otherwise lackluster. And through this bare minimum of what I can't even call research, you might get the impression that, instead of distracting players and critics from any problems that the other areas of the game might have, the one aspect of Trek to Yomi that absolutely everyone seems to agree is a glorious victory also draws attention to those elements that fail to live up to that quality. I suppose what I'm saying is, can the most aesthetically successful game that I've had the pleasure of playing ever come close to living up to that title? Is Trek to Yomi actually any good? Well... from a gameplay perspective, meh. There's certainly something to be said for the idea that it's repetitive, constantly fighting the same types of enemies in faraway battles that simultaneously remove the grit and the detail of close-ups of other melee games, make it difficult to see what's going on to the point where you might find yourself dying to a few cases of simply misunderstanding what's in front of you, and make it glaringly obvious that enemies are lining up to fight you one at a time, dispelling the illusion provided by the closer perspectives of other games that cut most of your rivals out of the frame at any one time. You learn moves as you progress through the game, of course, like in any title with similar combat, but the dissatisfactory weighting of those means that, if you're as bad as me, you can suffer and struggle after the first couple of chapters, before then picking up one or two of the handful of moves that basically allows you to bypass any area entirely untouched, whilst also regaining your health. And these aren't even the result of some clever RPG build that utilises the best possible combination of some skill chain. No, if you play through Trek to Yomi, you will unlock these nigh unstoppable moves. What this means in practice is that the early mid stages of the game are far more difficult than the unfortunately repetitive health farming of the latter half, right up until the final boss fight, at which point you realise that you are ill-equipped to face the one enemy in the entire game that can't be breezed past using the same two moves that have carried you this far under the assumption that you have found your calling as some utterly undefeatable samurai god. Luckily, you just have to use this move that you learned right at the start and then do a roll every time he summons this orb, but if I'm completely honest, that took me quite some time to figure out. One feature of the combat that I did actually enjoy, and this will come as a surprise, is how it looked.
Shocking.
The way that every scene is mapped onto the backlit black and white landscape makes it seem like every shot, every moment, was carefully curated from the visions of an artist rather than being improvised because you happened to press X at that particular moment. It can be hard to believe that it's not, at the very least, some cutscene that is feigning interactivity with a series of button prompts. No, this is how the least premeditated moments of the game end up looking, which has every fight feeling that you're feasting your eyes on some newly uncovered samurai cinema rather than, watching what happens when you press a couple of buttons. Functionally, this is no different from the enjoyment that a baby gets from pressing a cow button and hearing a mooing sound. But that's definitely not how it feels as you swing your sword and send specks of blood flying across the monochromatic images of a world set ablaze in your absence. The black and white scenery and filmic lighting and layout also obscure secret paths that allow for exploration to genuinely feel rewarding, especially if your investigations helped you to uncover a health shrine or a way to bypass what looks like a tough encounter. It's a strange way for the game's good looks to interact with the player's experience, but the lack of, for instance, magenta highlights pointing you towards every useful object meant that these moments felt that little more stimulating than simply following a clearly signposted path that you know ahead of time is going to lead to great loot. I also found it strangely sensible that there's something of a difficulty spike during the final boss fight, as not only are you facing the toughest enemy who has already killed your mentor and defeated you twice, once fatally might I add, but also there's this resurrection that keeps occurring where you are brought back from Yomi to face the foe that took away your love and duty, and in Kagura's prior defeat that should have left him in the ground for good. It feels like an eternal and impossible fight, which is at the very least a convenient excuse that I made for myself every time I died in the third stage of the battle and got sent right back to the beginning. And another gameplay element that I genuinely enjoyed was the stamina trade-off as you upgrade your stamina, allowing you to fight for longer at any one time but leaving you in this useless, moribund, stamina-less state for a longer time if you run out. Meaning that as you develop the protagonist's abilities, you also have to keep a closer eye on those few elements that you are expected to manage throughout the combat. At least, I think this is the case. It felt like the case. But I have no idea if the waiting time was actually longer, or maybe I just got more impatient with myself as the game and the errors continued hand in hand, feeling just a little longer every time I made that silly mistake yet again. Either way, using it up becomes a worse offence as you progress, meaning that you're forced to learn quickly in a way that's challenging enough without ever becoming too tedious. I understand that these are not particularly great positives on the gameplay front. Two of them are excuses to discuss the aesthetics again, one is a flimsy justification for an irritating difficulty spike, and the last one probably doesn't even exist. But if you were here for quality insights into the merits of games, you wouldn't be. But what this does tell us is that the gameplay is not particularly in favour of the idea that Trek to Yomi is really offering anything outside of its most highly praised component, so perhaps it's time to move on. The key characters of Trek to Yomi are mostly people whose names I had to Google, but that doesn't mean they're not good. It just means that they tend to blend into the menageries of characters whose key traits have been stolen and stuck onto the key figures from the game, which isn't great, to be honest. Perhaps the worst offender of the bunch in this regard is Aiko, who should really be doing more throughout the story and preferably in a much more proactive manner. I would have loved to see her as something more than a disappearing child and a silenced, ghostly apparition, preferably in a role that explored a bit more of the genuinely interesting and agency-holding character that she briefly displayed in those few moments we had with her as a living adult. Based upon the somewhat similar societal roles, and both being the subject of a samurai's protective duties, I was expecting, or perhaps just hoping for, a character who more closely resembled Princess Yuki from the Hidden Fortress, who finds herself able to display and communicate a wide array of characteristics, each of which tells us about her role in the story and the world that she lived in before going on the run, even in those scenes where she wordlessly makes her way through the war-torn setting, which is exactly what Aiko manages to do with all the personality of a doormat. She just drifts ahead and doesn't offer much in the way of interesting temperament, despite clearly having a commanding character in our brief glimpses of both her childhood and adulthood. In fact, she's so boring once she dies that the biggest reaction I had to anything related to her after that point was when she disappears into the water and is replaced by this demon thing, which at least gave some kind of tension or displayed that it had intentions and feelings, although mostly murderous ones, towards the guilt-riddled Hiroki. Overall, she felt like an obvious weak point in the story, a void that only made it all the more strange as I chose to declare my eternal and undying love for someone who seems to have lost any semblance of a personality after being turned into a Force ghost. But wait a second, Force ghosts? In a game clearly drawing upon the film that inspired Star Wars? There's a punchline there, but you can find it for yourself. But whilst the game's key figures do all come across as slightly one-note replicas of typical character types within the genre, they do still have a fair amount to offer, having perhaps been picked as the best possible versions of those tropes, with the scoundrel warlord, the honor-bound warrior, the aging deceased mentor, and the one who inspires the protagonist to victory through forgiving his failure to stand by those that he swore to protect. Wait a minute, this is just Kung Fu Panda, isn't it? Besides my aforementioned criticisms of Aiko's personality though, I do feel like these characters work well enough in tandem to provide a sense of legitimacy to the stakes of the narrative, which is especially important because a third of the way into the game you lose everything that your protagonist has any interest in protecting, so without compelling characters there would be absolutely no reason to keep going. Instead, we want to see Hiroki avenge the two people closest to him, and we want to see their killer defeated once and for all. It's simple, but it's effective. and therefore is easily enough to carry our interest through to the end of a game that's only really 5 or so hours long. These clear-cut characters combine well enough with the mise en scène that every moment is dripping with character and style, proving an effective homage to the films that irrefutably inspired these dazzling moments. Most obviously those of Kurosawa, of course, even if Trek to Yomi never quite captures the magnificent filmmaking displays of what are often considered some of the greatest pictures ever put to the big screen. So the characters, in my mind, do support the idea that Trek to Yomi has some substance beyond its style. Note that I don't say style over substance because style is substance and it is perfectly valid to focus on that instead of other ideas. Sorry about that little tangent, I feel strongly about this. But for me, the roles that they help to fill provide the game's narrative with the context that it needs in order to do anything beyond present itself as a few fancy looking cutscenes. If there hadn't been anything but visual style, I never would have played beyond the end of the second chapter. But instead I rushed my way through all 7 because I was compelled by the people involved in the events unfolding as I slashed my way through Hiroki's myriad enemies on the way to avenge those that were taken from him. And speaking of events, so Trek to Yomi's story is basically as follows. Bandits attack when you're a kid, killing your mentor who slays their leader and then makes you promise to look after Eiko once he's gone. Then as an adult you abandon your post to defeat some other bandits and the original bandits attack and kill everyone whilst you're away. You then die at the hands of the somehow resurrected bandit leader that your mentor killed, but then you fight your way through the afterlife, achieve resurrection, and stab him until even his ghost vampire form is defeated. It's very simple and entirely predictable throughout, but again, I don't find that to be indicative of poor quality. Sure, if you don't want to play a game where you know what's going to happen the entire time, well, firstly, sorry for telling you the entire plot just now. I did say spoilers right at the start, to be fair. Spoilers. And secondly, I would ask you what story you go to with genuinely no idea of what's going to happen. Trek to Yomi simply leans into the predetermined nature of its narrative by placing you, newfound cool guy and warrior hero, within the films that inspired so much of Western cinema. Actually, now that I say it out loud, Westerns in particular were taken straight from the samurai story, and I'm not just talking about the Magnificent Seven. Anyway, we all love to see a tale of a hero rising up to triumph over evil, especially if we can see it from a uniquely interactive and immersive perspective that video games can provide. And what Trek to Yomi does with its story is exactly that, providing an opportunity for us to overcome impossible odds, and to fight for love, and for honour, and for the 25G Xbox Live achievement that you get for completing the game. I simply don't understand the idea that the story being simple is worthy of criticisms when some of the greatest games of all time are imbued with far more simplistic narratives. Just look at any given Doom game or Animal Crossing. We don't complain about the lack of narrative drive in racing games or the obviousness of the princess always being in another castle. Video games are there to be enjoyed, often really off one element and one element alone, and whilst it's maybe true that it's more valid to aim criticism often reserved for other media at Trek to Yomi because of its insistence upon calling on those giants upon whose shoulders it stands, making film arguments more valid because, it's a film. That just means you're calling out a piece of art for trying to do something different from the rest of its medium, and that will never sit right with me. Sorry, that was a very weird and tired rambling, and I don't know if it makes sense, but to summarise, Trek to Yomi's story is perfectly functional, and that is all that it needs to be. It ticks every box that it has to, and in my eyes that ensures that it's at least good, right? Trek to Yomi is a game that does have more to offer than just what meets the eye, hiding strong elements beneath the label of only being good for one thing and one thing only. Whilst its gameplay can drag on a bit, its characters and story provide the perfect backdrop to submerge ourselves within the hitherto uninteractive world of noble figures in the way of the warrior, and particularly seeing as it's currently free for anyone who has Game Pass, I'd strongly recommend giving it a go, and hopefully seeing for yourself that there's more than just looks to a game with the reputation of some vacuous blonde stereotype. I just thought of that connection, and now I cannot stop pondering about the bimboification of the samurai film and the possibility of making that into a new video. Anyway, I have clearly just completely lost my mind today, and so I'm going to stop here. Thank you so much for watching, and if you did enjoy the video, I really do always appreciate every like or comment that's kindly sent my way. But now, hopefully with all of that begging nonsense out of the way, I will see you next time.